The unexpected encounter. Grace Whitman's morning began like any other, marked by her relentless drive toward success. The crisp October air filled the bustling city as she weaved through the crowd of office-goers, her high heels echoing a sense of purpose on the busy pavement. At 34, Grace had perfected her routine, ensuring that no detail was left to chance. Her structured life had always been centered around one thing: climbing the corporate ladder. As a senior marketing strategist at one of the largest firms in the city, she was known for her sharp mind, ambition, and unwavering determination to reach the top. Today was no exception. Her tailored gray suit fit impeccably, and her sleek blonde hair was tied in a tight bun that signified her no-nonsense attitude. She had a big presentation ahead of her, one that could define her career. The stakes were high, and she had spent the entire week perfecting every slide and statistic. This was her moment. Grace barely glanced at the pedestrians as she strode toward her office building, mentally rehearsing her opening lines for the pitch. The towering structure loomed ahead, a place she had come to think of as a second home over the years. The building represented not only her current job but her ambitions, her hopes for the future. She was determined to rise to the top and take her rightful place among the city's most successful businesswomen. As she approached the building's grand glass entrance, Grace's phone buzzed with a notification. A quick glance told her it was from her boss, reminding her of the meeting time. It was just a formality. Grace knew the schedule by heart. After all, she had built her career on being prepared for every possible scenario. She slipped her phone back into her designer handbag, her heels tapping across the marble floor as she entered the lobby. The familiar scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted from the cafe in the corner, and the soft hum of conversations filled the space. Grace, however, was focused only on getting to the 32nd floor where her office awaited. She strode confidently toward the bank of elevators, pressed the button, and glanced at her reflection in the sleek, mirrored wall beside her. As always, she looked immaculate. No stray hair, no wrinkles in her clothes, not a hint of hesitation in her eyes. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Grace stepped forward. She was the only one there, but just as the doors were about to close, a hand shot out to stop them. Grace's gaze flicked to the hand. A man's hand, dark-skinned and strong. She frowned slightly, feeling a moment of irritation. She was in no mood for distractions today. The doors slid open again, revealing a tall black man, casually dressed in dark jeans and a button-down shirt. His posture was relaxed, and there was a quiet confidence about him, something Grace found almost unnerving. She immediately sized him up, her mind jumping to conclusions before she could stop herself. He was likely a delivery worker or someone from maintenance, she assumed. The man stepped into the elevator and offered her a polite nod. "Morning," he said, his voice deep but calm, as though the rush of the city didn't touch him. Grace barely acknowledged him, her eyes darting to the floor buttons. She pressed the button for her floor, noticing with some relief that he didn't select a lower one, meaning they wouldn't have to stop before reaching her destination. She shifted her weight, impatient to get on with her day. As the elevator began its ascent, Grace tried to focus on her presentation, mentally reviewing her notes. Yet she couldn't help but feel slightly uncomfortable sharing the small space with this stranger. It wasn't anything overt, but there was something about him that made her uneasy. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, as if he belonged here, in this prestigious building, even though his attire suggested otherwise. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. Grace could feel the tension in the air, though the man beside her seemed perfectly at ease. Finally, she couldn't resist breaking it. "Which floor are you going to?" she asked, her voice cool, as if the answer mattered to her plans. The man turned to her with a faint smile. "Same as you," he replied, his tone unhurried. He didn't offer any further explanation, and Grace didn't ask. But now, her mind was spinning. Why was he headed to the 32nd floor, the executive level, dressed like that? Did he have a delivery to make? Was he meeting someone important? Her thoughts were interrupted as the elevator smoothly reached its destination. The doors slid open, revealing the sleek, modern offices of the top-tier executives. Grace stepped out, her heels clicking on the polished floor. To her surprise, the man followed her, walking at a leisurely pace, as if he had all the time in the world. She resisted the urge to glance back at him, feeling her irritation rise again. Grace strode toward the glass-walled conference room where her colleagues were gathering. Her boss, Mr. Edwards, stood at the head of the table, glancing at his watch. The room was filled with the firm's top executives, all dressed in sharp suits, their expressions focused and serious. "Ah, Grace, right on time," Mr. Edwards said with a smile as she entered. "We're just about ready to begin." Grace gave him a brief nod, already in business mode. She took her seat near the front, pulling out her tablet and preparing to showcase the presentation she had spent countless hours perfecting. But before she could fully settle in, something strange happened. Mr. Edwards glanced past her, his eyes lighting up in recognition. "Leonard, good to see you," he said warmly, extending his hand. Grace's heart skipped a beat as she turned to see the man from the elevator. Still casual, still calm, walking into the room. Her mind struggled to process what was happening. Leonard. This man had a name. And more importantly, he seemed to be someone her boss knew well. Leonard shook Mr. Edwards' hand with an easy smile. "Likewise," he said. "I've been looking forward to seeing the progress on the new strategy." Grace blinked, her thoughts racing. Strategy. Progress. Who was this man? And then, in a moment of clarity, it hit her. This was no delivery worker or maintenance man. Leonard was here for the meeting. He was part of the executive team, or maybe something even more. But how could that be? Grace had never seen him before, never heard of him in the endless boardroom discussions or strategy meetings. Her heart pounded as she realized the truth. She had misjudged him completely. And the worst part, the man she had dismissed without a second thought wasn't just a part of the company. He was its CEO. Grace's world tilted on its axis. She had built her career on reading people, on understanding the nuances of power and influence. But in just one brief encounter, she had completely misread the most important person in the room. And now she would have to face the consequences of that mistake. The question that lingered in her mind as the meeting began was simple, yet overwhelming. How could she make it right? Unraveling assumptions, Grace sat frozen in her chair, struggling to mask the wave of disbelief crashing over her. The room bustled with energy as her colleagues engaged in small talk, but all Grace could hear was the deafening silence in her mind. Leonard. The man she had just dismissed as a delivery worker was Leonard Anderson, the CEO of the very company she had spent years climbing through. Her thoughts raced, and her composure, her most prized asset in the corporate world, was beginning to unravel. Grace had always prided herself on being observant, able to read people with ease, assessing their worth and influence in a matter of moments. In fact, it was that very skill that had propelled her career forward, guiding her through boardrooms filled with powerful men and women. Yet, in the span of a few minutes, she had misjudged Leonard entirely. And now, the weight of that realization bore down on her. Across the room, Leonard engaged with Mr. Edwards in casual conversation. His demeanor hadn't changed, still calm, composed, and exuding a quiet authority that commanded attention. Grace found herself studying him in a new light, trying to piece together how she could have missed the signs. He didn't fit the mold of the typical corporate CEO she was used to. There were no expensive suits, no entourage, no air of arrogance. Leonard moved through the space with the ease of someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Her thoughts were interrupted as Mr. Edwards cleared his throat, signaling the start of the meeting. "All right, everyone, let's get started. We got a lot to cover today." He motioned for Leonard to take a seat at the head of the table, the spot typically reserved for the CEO. Grace's heart sank as Leonard sat down, only a few chairs away from her. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, embarrassment creeping in. She had always prided herself on being professional and composed, but the situation had thrown her completely off balance. The meeting began with a review of the company's quarterly performance, and Grace did her best to focus, though her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about the interaction in the elevator, the casual way she had dismissed Leonard, the subtle disdain in her voice. Had he noticed? Of course he had. Grace's skin prickled with anxiety at the thought. She wasn't someone who made mistakes like this, especially not in front of someone with as much influence as Leonard Anderson. The conversation shifted to the upcoming marketing strategy, which was Grace's cue to present. She straightened in her seat, willing herself to focus. This presentation had been her top priority for weeks, the key to securing her position in the company's leadership team. She couldn't afford to let her mistake cloud her judgment now. "Grace, why don't you take us through the proposed strategy?" Mr. Edwards said, offering her a nod. She stood up, smoothing her hands over her skirt, and made her way to the front of the room. Taking a deep breath, she connected her tablet to the projector, and the slides she had meticulously crafted appeared on the screen. This was her moment to shine. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice steady. "Over the past few months, our team has been working on a new marketing strategy designed to expand our brand reach and drive growth in emerging markets. What you're about to see is a detailed plan that aligns with the company's broader vision." As she spoke, Grace felt a small sense of relief. This was her comfort zone. She knew her work inside and out, and as she moved through the slides, discussing key metrics, growth projections, and creative campaigns, her confidence began to return. She had always excelled at presenting, and despite the awkwardness of the morning, she was determined to deliver. But as her presentation continued, Grace couldn't help but notice Leonard's expression. He wasn't frowning or glaring, quite the opposite. He listened intently, his hands folded in front of him, occasionally nodding along. Yet there was something in his gaze that unnerved her. It wasn't judgmental, but it was perceptive, as though he were looking past her polished slides and professional demeanor, straight into her core. Grace's mouth went dry, and her carefully rehearsed speech faltered for a moment. She quickly recovered, moving on to the next slide, but the damage had been done. She felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she hadn't expected. Leonard wasn't like the other executives she had presented to over the years. He wasn't impressed by flashy numbers or buzzwords. He was studying her, evaluating more than just her marketing plan, and that realization sent a chill down her spine. When she finally finished the presentation, there was a smattering of polite applause from her colleagues. Grace forced a smile as she returned to her seat, but her heart was pounding. She could feel Leonard's gaze still on her, and the weight of his presence seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. "Thank you, Grace," Mr. Edwards said, giving her an approving nod. "That was an excellent overview." Before she could reply, Leonard spoke for the first time since the meeting began. "I have a few thoughts," he said, his voice calm but commanding. All eyes in the room turned toward him. Grace braced herself, unsure of what was coming. Leonard leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the screen where the last slide of her presentation still lingered. "You've done a great job outlining the strategy," he began, his tone thoughtful. "But there's something missing." Grace's stomach dropped. Missing. Her mind raced, trying to figure out what he was referring to. She had spent weeks on this presentation, refining every detail. What could she have overlooked? Leonard continued, unfazed by the tension in the room. "The numbers are strong, and the campaigns are creative. But what's the story behind it? The emotional core of the brand. We can have the best metrics in the world, but if we don't connect with our audience on a deeper level, we're not going to achieve the kind of impact we're aiming for." The room was silent as his words hung in the air. Grace felt a rush of humiliation. She had focused so much on the technical aspects of the strategy, the numbers, the projections, that she had neglected to infuse it with the emotional resonance Leonard was talking about. It was a rookie mistake, one she hadn't expected to be called out on, especially not in front of the CEO. Leonard glanced at her, his expression neutral but piercing. "You've got the framework, Grace. Now let's work on filling it with substance. Show me the heart of the brand." Grace's face flushed with heat. She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Of course," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur. Grace could barely concentrate on what was being said as her mind replayed Leonard's words over and over. She had been so focused on impressing the higher-ups with her professionalism, her polish, that she had lost sight of the bigger picture. As the meeting adjourned, Grace quickly gathered her things, eager to escape the conference room and the humiliation that still clung to her like a second skin. But as she moved toward the door, she heard Leonard's voice behind her. "Grace, could we have a word?" She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Slowly, she turned to face him. Leonard stood near the head of the table, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. His expression was unreadable. "Of course," she said, forcing a smile. He waited for the others to file out of the room before speaking again. "I wanted to thank you for the work you've done," he said, his tone surprisingly warm. "You've got talent, and I can see why you've come this far. But there's more to leadership than just delivering flawless presentations." Grace nodded, though she wasn't sure where he was going with this. "Don't be afraid to show who you are," Leonard continued, his gaze steady. "People respond to authenticity, to vulnerability. That's where real connections are made." His words struck a chord deep within her, and for the first time, Grace saw Leonard not as the CEO she had misjudged, but as someone who understood the complexities of leadership far better than she did. He wasn't just talking about the marketing strategy. He was talking about her. And in that moment, Grace realized that the real journey she needed to embark on wasn't just up the corporate ladder. It was one that required her to look inward, to confront the assumptions and biases that had shaped her career and her life. As she left the conference room, Grace felt a strange mixture of shame and hope. Leonard had seen through her facade, but instead of condemning her, he had offered her a chance to grow. And for the first time in a long while, Grace felt a glimmer of excitement about the future, not just for her career, but for the person she could become. A shift in perspective. The week following the meeting was a whirlwind for Grace. She had expected to feel a sense of relief after her presentation, but Leonard's words continued to weigh heavily on her mind. It wasn't the critique itself that unsettled her. She had received feedback before. But this was different. Leonard hadn't just critiqued her work. He had challenged her as a person. The next few days were filled with a mixture of anxiety and introspection. Grace couldn't stop thinking about the elevator ride, the assumptions she had made, and the subtle yet impactful way Leonard had peeled back the layers of her polished exterior. For the first time in years, she questioned not just her approach to work, but her approach to people. Had she become so focused on advancing her career that she had lost touch with what truly mattered? Had her ambition blinded her to the importance of empathy and authenticity? Grace spent long hours at her desk, poring over the marketing strategy, trying to incorporate Leonard's feedback. She revised the campaigns, infusing them with stories that connected on a deeper, more emotional level. But it wasn't just the work that changed. As she looked over her notes, she began to question her entire approach to leadership and success. In her relentless pursuit of perfection, Grace realized she had distanced herself from her team. She was respected, but not liked. Her colleagues admired her professionalism, but rarely approached her for advice or collaboration. And it wasn't hard to see why. She had built walls around herself, projecting an image of competence that left little room for vulnerability. One evening, as the sun set behind the towering skyscrapers outside her office window, Grace found herself staring at her reflection in the glass. She didn't like what she saw. Yes, she was successful, her career was on track, and she was well regarded in her field. But there was something missing, something that Leonard's words had unearthed. Her thoughts drifted back to Leonard, the calmness with which he had delivered his feedback, and the quiet authority he exuded. He wasn't the type of CEO she had expected. He wasn't loud or brash, didn't command attention through fear or intimidation. Instead, he led by example, with a presence that drew people in rather than pushing them away. It was a form of leadership Grace had never experienced before, and it intrigued her. That night, as she prepared to leave the office, she made a decision. She wasn't going to let this opportunity pass by. Leonard had offered her a rare chance to grow, not just as a professional, but as a person, and she wasn't going to squander it. The next morning, Grace arrived at the office early, determined to take a different approach. She greeted her colleagues with genuine smiles, asked them about their weekends, and even offered to help with projects that weren't her responsibility. It felt strange at first, almost unnatural, but as the day went on, she began to notice subtle shifts in the way people responded to her. They seemed more relaxed, more open, and for the first time in a long while, Grace felt a connection to the people she worked with. Later that afternoon, she received an unexpected email from Leonard's assistant, requesting a follow-up meeting. Grace's heart raced as she read the message. Was this about her presentation? Had she done something wrong? Or was this another chance to prove herself? When the time came for the meeting, Grace made her way to the executive floor with a sense of nervous anticipation. The sleek, modern design of the space seemed to amplify the gravity of the situation. As she approached Leonard's office, she couldn't help but feel a mix of fear and hope. His assistant waved her in, and Grace stepped into the room. Leonard sat behind a minimalist glass desk, his attention focused on a stack of papers in front of him. When he looked up, his face softened into a welcoming smile. "Grace, good to see you. Please, have a seat." She sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, trying to steady her nerves. "I wanted to check in with you about the marketing strategy," Leonard began. "You've made some great revisions, and I can see that you've really taken the feedback to heart. But that's not the only reason I asked you here." Grace raised an eyebrow, unsure of where the conversation was heading. "I've been watching you these past few days," Leonard continued, his tone even but sincere. "I've noticed a change in the way you interact with the team. You're engaging more, listening more, and it's not going unnoticed." Grace blinked in surprise. She had made an effort, yes, but she hadn't realized anyone had been paying attention, least of all Leonard. "There's something I want to share with you," he said, leaning forward slightly. "I didn't always lead the way I do now. In fact, early in my career, I was a lot like you. Focused, driven, and determined to prove myself. I thought that success meant keeping my head down, perfecting my work, and climbing the ladder as fast as I could." Grace listened intently, intrigued by this rare glimpse into Leonard's past. "But somewhere along the way," he continued, "I realized that success without connection is hollow. You can win all the accolades, secure all the promotions, but if you're not making a difference in the lives of the people around you, what's the point?" His words struck a chord deep within her. Grace had always believed that success was about personal achievement, about proving herself to others and reaching the top. But what Leonard was describing was something different, something more fulfilling. "There's a quote I live by," Leonard said, his eyes locking onto hers. "People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care." Grace felt a lump form in her throat. Those words resonated with her in a way she hadn't expected. She had always thought that her knowledge, her skills, and her work ethic were enough. But Leonard was right. There was more to leadership than just being good at your job. It was about caring for the people around you, about creating an environment where others could thrive, not just yourself. "I see potential in you, Grace," Leonard said, his voice gentle but firm. "You're talented, and you have the ability to make a real impact here. But I want you to think about what kind of leader you want to be. Are you going to be someone who climbs the ladder for your own benefit, or are you going to be someone who lifts others as you rise?" Grace's eyes stung with unshed tears. She hadn't expected this level of honesty, of vulnerability, from someone in Leonard's position. But his words felt like a lifeline, offering her a chance to change, to become the kind of person and leader she had always admired, but never thought she could be. "I don't expect you to have all the answers right away," Leonard added, leaning back in his chair, "but I wanted to plant that seed. Take your time, reflect on it, and when you're ready, let's talk about where you want to go from here." Grace nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Leonard smiled again, a warm and genuine expression that put her at ease. "You're welcome. Now, go out there and show the world what you're really capable of." As Grace left Leonard's office, she felt a strange mixture of emotions: gratitude, humility, and an overwhelming sense of possibility. For the first time in years, she saw her career not just as a path to personal success, but as a way to uplift others, to create something meaningful. The elevator ride down felt different this time. Grace stood taller, her mind buzzing with new ideas and possibilities. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to be the same person she was before. And that realization filled her with a quiet, determined hope. In the days that followed, Grace began to embrace this new perspective, not just in her work, but in her daily life. She reached out to colleagues she hadn't spoken to in months, asked for feedback from her team, and even started mentoring a junior employee who had been struggling to find her footing. The walls she had built around herself began to crumble, and in their place, Grace discovered a sense of purpose she hadn't known she was missing. Leonard's words continued to echo in her mind, guiding her through this transformation. Success without connection is hollow. Grace was determined to ensure that her success, whatever form it took, would be filled with meaning, both for herself and for those around her. And as she stood in front of the mirror each morning, preparing for the day ahead, Grace no longer saw just a sharp, ambitious woman climbing the corporate ladder. She saw a leader in the making, someone who was learning, growing, and most importantly, connecting with the world around her in ways she had never thought possible. The unveiling. Weeks had passed since Grace's pivotal conversation with Leonard, and though she was still adjusting to her new perspective, the change in her demeanor was palpable. She no longer approached work with the single-minded determination to rise above everyone else. Instead, she began to find joy in lifting others along with her. This shift didn't go unnoticed by her colleagues. Her once intimidating presence had softened, and in its place, a more approachable, empathetic leader was emerging. One morning, as Grace was wrapping up her morning routine of responding to emails, a notification popped up from Human Resources. It was an invitation to the company's annual corporate retreat. Normally, these events didn't excite her. She had always viewed them as tedious affairs where ambitious colleagues jockeyed for attention from senior leadership. But this year, with everything that had happened, Grace saw the retreat as an opportunity to solidify the growth she had been cultivating. The retreat was to be held at a luxurious resort just outside the city, and as Grace read through the itinerary, she noticed something unusual. Leonard would be leading one of the key sessions on leadership and corporate culture, a session that, in previous years, would have been led by more traditional, hard-nosed executives. The theme of the session was Leading with Purpose, how authenticity can drive success. The irony was not lost on Grace. Just a few weeks ago, she would have been skeptical of such a session, dismissing it as fluff. But now, after her encounters with Leonard, she was eager to attend and see how he would approach the subject. The day of the retreat arrived, and Grace found herself driving to the resort with a renewed sense of curiosity. The sprawling grounds of the resort, framed by lush gardens and towering trees, provided a serene backdrop that felt worlds away from the fast-paced hustle of the city. As she stepped into the grand lobby, a sense of calm washed over her. This wasn't just a retreat. It was a chance to reset, to deepen her newfound understanding of leadership, and to connect with her peers in a more meaningful way. The retreat began with a series of team-building exercises and workshops, but it was Leonard's session that everyone seemed to be waiting for. When the time finally came, the conference room filled quickly, with executives and managers from every department settling into their seats, eager to hear from the man who had become somewhat of an enigma in the company. Leonard entered the room quietly, without the usual fanfare that accompanied high-level executives. His presence, as always, commanded attention, not through volume, but through the quiet confidence that radiated from him. As he stood at the front of the room, he didn't open with a speech. Instead, he posed a question. "What does leadership mean to you?" The room fell silent. It wasn't the typical opening for a corporate session, and Grace could see the uncertainty on her colleagues' faces. Leonard waited, his eyes scanning the room, encouraging anyone brave enough to speak up. One by one, hands began to rise, and people shared their thoughts. Some spoke of leadership in terms of strategy and vision. Others mentioned decision-making and accountability. Grace listened closely, reflecting on her own evolving understanding of leadership. When it was her turn to speak, she hesitated for a moment before raising her hand. "For me, leadership used to be about control, about making sure I was the best, the most efficient, the one who stood out," she began, her voice steady but reflective. "But recently, I've started to see that leadership is more about connection. It's about understanding the people around you, creating space for others to succeed, and using your own growth to inspire those you lead." There was a moment of silence after she spoke, and Grace felt her heart race. Had she said too much? Was she being too vulnerable in a room full of people who still saw her as the cutthroat professional she once was? But Leonard's expression softened, and a small smile appeared on his face. "That's a powerful realization," he said, his voice warm. "And it's a lesson many people take years to learn, if they ever learn it at all." As the session continued, Leonard shared his own journey, echoing some of the themes he had discussed with Grace during their one-on-one meeting. He spoke of his early years in the corporate world, how he had been taught that leadership was about dominance and control. But over time, he had come to realize that true leadership was about creating environments where people felt safe, valued, and empowered to bring their whole selves to work. "What I've learned," Leonard said, his gaze sweeping the room, "is that the most successful organizations aren't the ones with the most aggressive leaders. They're the ones with leaders who listen, who adapt, and who understand that the people they lead are their greatest asset. The more you invest in your team, the more your team will invest in the success of the organization." Grace was captivated. Leonard's approach to leadership was a radical departure from the cutthroat, results-driven culture she had known for so long. But it resonated deeply with her, aligning with the shift she had been experiencing in her own life. She found herself nodding along, feeling the deep sense of affirmation that she was on the right path. After the session ended, the attendees were encouraged to mingle and discuss what they had learned. Grace found herself in conversation with a group of executives from different departments. Normally, she would have seen this as an opportunity to network, to position herself for future opportunities. But this time, her focus was different. She listened more than she spoke, genuinely interested in the perspectives of others. One of the executives, a woman from the finance department named Olivia, shared her own challenges with leadership. "I've always struggled with feeling like I have to prove myself, especially as a woman in a male-dominated field," Olivia said. "It's exhausting, constantly having to be on guard, to make sure I'm not seen as weak." Grace nodded empathetically. "I know exactly what you mean. I used to feel like I had to project this image of perfection all the time, like I couldn't show any vulnerability. But I'm starting to realize that being authentic, being human, doesn't make you weak. It actually makes you stronger." Olivia smiled, clearly relieved to find someone who understood. "It's so refreshing to hear that. I've been feeling so burnt out lately, trying to keep up this facade. Maybe it's time for me to try a different approach." As the conversation continued, Grace felt a sense of camaraderie she hadn't experienced in a long time. These weren't just colleagues. They were people with their own struggles and triumphs, their own hopes and fears, and for the first time, Grace felt like she was part of something bigger than just her own ambition. Later that evening, as the retreat's activities wound down, Grace found herself standing by the pool, gazing out at the peaceful landscape. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the horizon, and the gentle hum of conversation filled the air. She felt a sense of contentment, of clarity. Just as she was about to head back to her room, she heard a familiar voice behind her. Grace. She turned to see Leonard walking toward her, his hands in his pockets, a relaxed smile on his face. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. "Not at all," she replied, smiling. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the sun dip below the trees. "You did great today," Leonard said finally. "I could see that the message really resonated with you." Grace nodded. "It did. I feel like I'm finally starting to understand what you meant. About leadership, about connection. It's a different way of thinking, but it feels right." Leonard smiled. "It's not always easy, especially in environments like ours, where the pressure to perform is so high. But once you start leading with purpose, with authenticity, it becomes much more fulfilling. You stop measuring success by titles and accolades and start measuring it by the impact you have on others." Grace took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words settle over her. "I think I'm ready for that." Leonard's smile widened. "I know you are." As they stood there, watching the last rays of sunlight fade into the night, Grace felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She was no longer just climbing the corporate ladder. She was building something real, something meaningful. And that, she realized, was the kind of success she had been searching for all along. An unforeseen opportunity. As the corporate retreat came to a close, Grace returned to the city with a new sense of purpose. The week had been a transformative experience, allowing her to solidify the changes she had been working on within herself. But she also knew that the real test would come when she stepped back into the high-pressure world of her company, where deadlines, competition, and expectations could easily pull her back into old habits. Back at the office, the energy felt different. Grace noticed small things, like how her colleagues greeted her with more warmth, how the tension that used to permeate their interactions had lessened. It was as if her personal shift had started to ripple outwards, creating a subtle but undeniable change in the office environment. Her team, too, seemed more engaged. They had always respected Grace's competence and drive, but now they responded to her leadership with a new level of trust. She had begun to listen more closely, offering support and encouragement where before she might have pushed harder for results. And as a result, the work they produced improved, not just in quality, but in creativity and innovation. Grace realized that by fostering a culture of collaboration and respect, the team had become more effective. A few weeks after the retreat, Grace received a surprising email from the CEO's office. It was an invitation to meet with the executive leadership team, a rare honor for someone at her level in the company. She was intrigued, but also a little apprehensive. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, and the agenda was vague. Still, Grace couldn't help but wonder if this was a sign that her new approach to leadership was being recognized. On the day of the meeting, Grace felt a mix of excitement and nerves. As she stepped into the sleek, glass-walled conference room on the top floor of the building, she was greeted by the sight of several high-ranking executives, including the CEO, seated around a long table. To her surprise, Leonard was there as well, sitting calmly at the far end of the room. Their eyes met, and he gave her a reassuring nod. "Grace, thank you for joining us," the CEO began, gesturing for her to take a seat. "We've been watching your progress closely, and I have to say, we're impressed with the results your team has been delivering recently. You've shown real growth as a leader." Grace's heart raced. This was the kind of recognition she had always craved, but it felt different now. She no longer needed validation in the same way she once had, but it was still gratifying to hear that her efforts were making a tangible impact. "Thank you," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "I've been focusing on building a more collaborative and inclusive environment for my team, and it seems to be paying off." The CEO nodded. "That's exactly what we've noticed. Your team's performance has improved significantly, and it hasn't gone unnoticed by senior leadership. In fact, we've been discussing a potential opportunity for you to take on a more prominent role within the company. Grace's breath caught. This was more than she had expected. She had thought the meeting might be about her recent success, but now it seemed like something much bigger was at play. We're planning a major reorganization of the company's leadership structure, the CEO continued. As part of that, we're looking for someone to spearhead a new initiative focused on corporate culture and employee engagement. It's a project that will require a leader with vision, empathy, and the ability to inspire others. And after seeing the work you've done recently, we believe you're the right person for the job. Grace was stunned. This was exactly the kind of opportunity she had once dreamed of, a chance to make a real impact on the company at a strategic level. But it was also daunting. The scope of the project was massive, and she knew it would come with immense responsibility. The CEO must have sensed her hesitation because he leaned forward, his expression serious but encouraging. This is a big step, I know. But we have faith in your ability to lead this initiative. You'll have the support of the executive team, and we'll be giving you the resources you need to succeed. What do you think? Grace took a moment to gather her thoughts. She glanced over at Leonard, who was watching her with a calm, knowing expression. In that moment, she remembered everything he had taught her. About leadership, about authenticity, about using her influence to create positive change. She knew that this was more than just a career advancement. It was an opportunity to bring the lessons she had learned to a wider audience, to transform the company from the inside out. I'm honored by the offer, Grace said finally, her voice steady but filled with purpose. And I'm ready to take on the challenge. The CEO smiled, clearly pleased with her response. That's what we were hoping to hear. You'll have some time to transition into the role, but we'll be announcing the reorganization in the coming weeks. We're excited to see what you'll do with this initiative. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur of logistical details and discussions about next steps. Grace listened intently, but her mind was already racing ahead, thinking about how she would approach this new role. By the time the meeting ended, she felt a mixture of exhilaration and apprehension. This was a monumental task, but she also knew it was the perfect opportunity to apply everything she had learned. As she left the conference room, Leonard caught up with her in the hallway. "Congratulations," he said, a proud smile on his face. "I had a feeling this was coming." Grace laughed, shaking her head. "I'm still in shock. I never expected anything like this." "You've earned it," Leonard said, his tone sincere. "Your growth has been remarkable, and the executive team sees that. This is your chance to take everything you've learned and put it into practice on a larger scale. I just hope I'm ready for it," Grace admitted. "This is going to be a huge responsibility." Leonard nodded thoughtfully. "It is. But remember what we talked about at the retreat. Leadership isn't about having all the answers or being perfect. It's about being real, about connecting with people, and empowering them to bring their best selves to the table. You've already started doing that with your team. Now you'll just be doing it on a bigger stage." Grace let his words sink in, feeling a sense of reassurance. She had come a long way from the woman who had been so focused on her own success that she had forgotten the importance of connection and empathy. This new role was a chance to continue that journey, to create a work environment where others could thrive just as she had begun to. As they walked back toward their offices, Leonard turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "You know, Grace, the real work of leadership isn't about the position or the title. It's about how you use your influence to make a difference in people's lives. And I think you're going to do an incredible job at that." Grace smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "Thanks, Leonard. I wouldn't be here without you." He shook his head, his smile humble. "You would have found your way eventually. I just gave you a nudge in the right direction." As Grace returned to her office, she couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement for the future. The opportunity before her was immense, but it was also exactly what she needed. A chance to lead with purpose, to inspire others, and to create a workplace where success wasn't just about individual achievement, but about collective growth. For the first time in a long time, Grace felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. And as she sat down at her desk, she knew that this was only the beginning of an even greater journey, the legacy of true leadership. The weeks following Grace's promotion were a whirlwind of activity. The executive reorganization was officially announced, and Grace's new role as the head of corporate culture and employee engagement became the talk of the office. It was a position she had never envisioned for herself, but now, standing on this platform, she felt the weight and excitement of a larger responsibility. Her first day in the new role was met with anticipation from both her team and the company at large. She had prepared meticulously, outlining her vision for the corporate culture initiative. But beyond the documents and strategies, Grace knew that the heart of her work was about shifting mindsets. It wasn't just about creating policies or offering perks. It was about embedding empathy, connection, and respect into the very fabric of the company's identity. Her first order of business was to conduct a series of meetings with different departments, listening to their concerns, ideas, and hopes for the company's future. This was no longer the old Grace who bulldozed through conversations, too focused on her own objectives to truly hear others. She had transformed. Now, she approached these conversations with a genuine desire to understand the people who made the company tick, their needs, their frustrations, and their aspirations. During one of these sessions, she met with the custodial staff, an often overlooked part of the corporate machine. It was there that Grace had a pivotal moment, one that brought her journey full circle. As she sat with the custodians in a small, unglamorous break room, she listened to their stories. Many of them spoke about feeling invisible, unnoticed, and unappreciated despite the critical role they played in keeping the office environment functional and clean. One woman in particular, Marisol, shared her experience of working for the company for over 15 years without ever receiving a proper acknowledgement for her service. Grace could see the tiredness in her eyes, the weariness of someone who had given so much without receiving much in return. This resonated deeply with Grace, who realized how she herself had once contributed to a culture of exclusion, whether consciously or unconsciously. "I promise you," Grace said softly, looking Marisol directly in the eye, "that things are going to change. What you and everyone here does matters, and it's time we make sure everyone knows that." Marisol smiled, though there was a hint of skepticism behind her gratitude. Grace understood. Words were easy, but action was harder, and the custodial staff had heard promises before that led to nothing. Grace left that meeting with a renewed sense of urgency. It wasn't enough to lead from her office or speak at meetings. She needed to make real changes that would improve the lives of everyone in the company, from the boardroom to the break room. One of her first major initiatives was the launch of a company-wide appreciation program. Employees at all levels were encouraged to publicly acknowledge the contributions of their colleagues, no matter their role. There were monthly recognition events where the staff who had made significant contributions, whether it was a manager leading a successful project or a custodian who ensured the office was immaculate, were honored. The program, named Echoes of Impact, emphasized that every action, no matter how small, reverberated throughout the company. At the first event, Grace stood in front of a packed auditorium. Marisol was there, sitting in the front row with her colleagues. Grace smiled at her before stepping up to the microphone. "When I first started here," Grace began, "I was so focused on my personal success that I didn't see the people around me. I didn't realize that it's not just the work we do, but how we do it and how we treat each other that defines success. Today, we're starting a new chapter, one where everyone, no matter their title or position, is valued for the impact they make." The room erupted into applause. Grace felt a swell of pride, not for herself, but for the company that was beginning to reflect the values she had come to embrace. When Marisol was called to the stage as one of the first honorees, the standing ovation she received brought tears to her eyes, and to Grace's. As the months went on, the culture of the company transformed. Departments that had once worked in silos began collaborating more fluidly. The tension that had once pervaded the office was replaced with a sense of camaraderie. People felt seen, heard, and valued, not just for their output, but for who they were. But Grace's work wasn't just about creating a better company. It was about creating a legacy. She wanted the changes she was implementing to last beyond her time in the role. So she developed a mentorship program that paired employees across departments, encouraging cross-level engagement and knowledge sharing. Senior leaders were paired with junior employees, and even the custodial staff and administrative assistants were part of the program, with the goal of building empathy and breaking down hierarchical barriers. Grace took on several mentees herself. One of them was a young woman named Alana, who reminded Grace of her younger self. Ambitious, driven, but somewhat isolated in her pursuit of success. Over time, Grace helped Alana see the importance of relationships, of working with others rather than against them, and of leading with empathy. One afternoon, after months of mentorship, Alana came to Grace's office, her eyes shining with excitement. "I wanted to thank you," Alana said, her voice filled with emotion. "I've learned so much from you, not just about how to succeed in this company, but how to be a better person. I never realized how much I was missing by keeping people at arm's length. You've shown me what real leadership looks like." Grace smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "I'm glad to hear that, Alana. But remember, leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about learning from others and growing together. You've got everything you need to make a difference." As the months turned into years, Grace's influence continued to grow. The company thrived under her leadership, not just in terms of profits, but in employee satisfaction and retention. More importantly, Grace had become a role model for a new generation of leaders, those who understood that true power came from lifting others up, not pushing them down. Leonard, who had quietly supported Grace throughout her journey, watched her success with a quiet pride. He had always known she was capable of great things, but seeing her transformation had been deeply gratifying. One day, as they met for their usual coffee, Leonard looked at Grace with a smile. "You've come a long way," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "You've built something real here, something that will outlast both of us." Grace looked out the window at the bustling city below, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. "I couldn't have done it without you," she replied. "You were the one who showed me that leadership is about more than just climbing the ladder." Leonard chuckled. "All I did was get on that elevator with you." They both laughed, the memory of their first encounter still fresh in their minds. It had been such a simple moment, but it had set off a chain of events that neither of them could have predicted. As they finished their coffee, Grace felt a sense of peace. She had spent so much of her life striving for success, only to realize that the true measure of a leader was not in titles or accolades, but in the lives they touched. And in that moment, Grace knew that her legacy was secure, not in the corner office she had once coveted, but in the hearts and minds of the people she had inspired along the way.